I'm in Atlanta,
Oh,
so
okay.
actually not too far from you guys.
Not far at all.
No, no, just I didn't realize before you guys being in Florida. I grew up in South Florida. I just assumed it was um, East Coast time. Luckily, someone righted the ship.
It's happened to me many
I was
times.
like, oh,
I think the cutoff
yeah,
is the Swanee River near Tallahassee.
Mhm.
yeah.
I've nearly missed
I've
everything.
never spent much time in
The Chattahoochee,
Panhandle.
Chattahoochee River.
Oh, okay.
That's the one that runs right down the Alabama-Georgia line.
Yeah, my family, my wife's family is from Alabama, so I always have to think about them in the other time zone. So I'm going to switch it up a little and talk about Vue.js since at least none of you that are there have had a lot of experience with it, to kind of talk about why it's different from some of the other um, frameworks, client-side frameworks that a lot of people are using. And then we'll go into a demo of one way to use it. In case none of you know who I am, I'll just put the little slide up here. I'm an instructor mostly. I teach both at Pluralsight and at Wilderminds, which is my company. I'm also making a film about software developers that should be out later this year or probably early next year, depending on when we get done with all that. And I'll share some links there later. All the code I'm going to be writing here will be available on my website, wildermuth.com, probably tomorrow when I get it all uploaded and everything. So feel free to follow along if you want, or you can just watch and get the code later. Makes it a little easier. Any questions before we get started?
I don't have anything.
Awesome.
No.
So I'm going to start with just this idea of SPA that becomes really important, and it's a phrase that I kind of hate because the term being single page application makes this assumption that we're sort of writing in JavaScript or TypeScript these web applications that are these large monolithic applications. They tend to be used in enterprises, and they tend to be used in enterprises as replacement for desktop apps. And the importance here with this term, and the reason I've never liked it, is it sort of assumed that you were going to have one giant piece of code that took over, all sorts of things, instead of really relying on the web to do some things that it does well and to take over when the web doesn't do things well. And usually this is about user interaction. So if you've been on a website, you want to be able to tab over, click on something to show a different tab, or you want to be able to save data or do validation, those sorts of things. The technologies behind these JavaScript frameworks are really good at doing, but it doesn't mean that, my big fear is always when someone goes, oh, I used Angular to build my blog. And I'm like, why? Because, a blog doesn't have any of these requirements that tell me I shouldn't be doing anything but just writing some markup, right? There's no, being able to press a little button and say, I like this maybe, but just the complexity of bringing in one of these frameworks, you better have a good payoff for it. And that payoff doesn't always mean that I get to put it on my resume when I leave, right? There needs to be a bigger payoff for me than just having a new skill. Because it does bring in quite a lot of complexity. You probably already got my messages with a SPA. And I also push this idea of all as my
I think we lost you for a second there. I'm not sure if it's buffering, maybe.
Video seems fine. We're just losing audio.
Yeah.
That's weird. Would it be easier for me to get on a phone call? Have you found that to be easier?
Yeah, there actually is a phone number for audio, if that might work.
Let me switch my headphones real quick and and call you on my cell phone. That might be better. That way we're not using bandwidth for both.
Okay.
Yeah, the desktop sharing seems to be fine.
Okay, good. It's weird that the audio, which is so much lower bandwidth, would be having the problem.
Let's see.
Almost there. Somewhere here it tells me about the meeting. There we go.
How's it going? Good. We're in the middle of switching over to a different audio source real quick. So good timing.
Good.
This meeting is being recorded. Can you guys hear me okay?
Let's see. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Hopefully that won't be a continual problem and I'll be able to hear you guys. So as I was talking about, I think spas are typically overused, and I like the idea of small sections that are done with these frameworks instead of one giant monolithic. And so that really comes to this idea of sort of enhancing websites as needed. And that's where I think something like Vue can really help, because unlike Angular and React, they can be used in a very simple and minimal way, but also scale up to complex scenarios. And so you can start with small ideas instead of sort of having to tie yourself into the into the whole ecosystem of the new JavaScript. Was that a question?
No, I think that was just some chairs shuffling.
Sorry, that's me.
Okay, no worries. So if you've used React before, you're probably used to this idea that you have some code and then you have a few compilers you go through until you get this package that's ready for the browser. And this works most of the time, but it does mean that in order to get into React, you need to have and learn these high-level concepts and have a build step specifically for the client-side code. And Angular is very similar to this. It has your code, has a different set of compilers, and then Webpack to create this browser-ready code. And Vue is different in this, that it's just a JavaScript library you would use, you would write your code, and it has a lot of the same features as React and Angular. As your application gets more complex, you can always bring in the compilers and the Webpack, but you don't have to have them from day one. They're optional in this case. And that's the strategy I'm going to show you today. I'm not going to show you the more complex writing a large application, but actually show you this very minimal usage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's go to the more interesting part of the talk, which is actual code, right? Is anyone a big fan of slides? I could write more slides if you'd like. So I've got a pretty simple app here. I'll just run it so you can see. It's just a simple web page that's going to show one or more rooms. And right now, these are just links over to separate pages to book those rooms. And I'd like this to be more easy for users to look at, so that they don't have to, post back to the server every time they want to look at or book a room or click and see more information about the room. And so I'm going to switch this to use Vue. Because I'm using JavaScript, I'm actually using package.json to tell me what libraries I need. And these are other libraries I'm already using, but I've included Vue as just a library here so that I can drag it onto my page and start using it. So let's do that. Let's go open up. And this isn't tied to ASP.NET in any way. That's what I live and breathe every day. So it's kind of where I start. So here's some Razor code that just puts together those rooms based on some data that's on the server, right? And so I'm going to start by creating a block up here called a section. And this section is going to be, I always forget what it is all of a sudden now. So that we can put all of our scripts that we're going to use here in the code. So I'm just going to open up Vue, and it really is just a library I can just drag into my project here. And all this script section does is insert it onto the page for me. And so we're also going to need to do this with a new piece of JavaScript. So I'm just going to create a quick index.js. That's where we're going to write all the code for our Vue application. Now, if you've done this before, if you've worked with JavaScript with Vue before, you probably note that I'm not using any of the build tools and CLI, and that's on purpose. I'm starting with this knowing that we could always scale up later. So how does this work? This works first because we want a section of a website, and I'm just going to create a new div here with the ID of the app or whatever you want to call it. The name here is actually pretty unimportant. And in my index.js, I'm just going to create a new object that I'll call the view as a new view object. And this object is going to take an object syntax that's going to specify all the pieces I want about the view. And the first thing is going to be what element or what object on the page does this view become responsible for. And so this is going to be a selector to that app, right? So we're basically saying that we're going to make Vue just responsible for this part of the page so far. We're going to expand this later, but just at a minimum, we could put a body tag there. We could say it's responsible for the whole page, but this would allow you to do these sort of discrete small pieces. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some data. And data is data that you want to display on the page as well as might want to manipulate with code. And so I'll start with something stupid like my name, right? And when this code runs, all it's going to do is look at the data and allow me to write code in the markup that decides to display it. And one way we can do that is with double curly braces, and just the data object is surfaced here inside of the app. And so I can just say name here, and it should go ahead and just put my plain old name on the page. Let's see if I've screwed this up. We can see that it's not actually working here. And the reason, if we look at the code, is Vue can't find the app. Well, let's figure out why that is. I named it right. Well, that's weird. I go to my cheat sheet because I always screw this up a little. No, that's fine. Why can't it find the app? That's very strange. And Vue is being loaded. Well, usually I don't have to go to the after this quickly. I'm not sure why it's not actually loading this correct. That's baffling. Nope. Cannot find element of the app. Okay, I'm going to go and cheat for a second. Sorry about this.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I would go on the fly, so I'm not going to say anything.
If you go clockwise with your mouse, sometimes it speeds it up.
Kind of like
There we
Superman.
go. Sure, it'll be really obvious as soon as I open this what I did wrong, but I don't think so. So here we have a div with the app, and here's that same name. And what we've done here is essentially the same. There's going to be obviously more code in here that I'll explain a little later. But we've got the app and the data here, and let's make sure that it's just not a version issue. I'm trying to run this again. Yeah. Using the same port. There's my name. Woo, right? It's just that easy. So I will actually know why it failed now, but let's just go on with this.
It was referencing the right location for the JS file.
Yeah, these are supposed to be at the bottom of the page just because of loading. Actually, I'm going to do the right thing. As much as I hate to switch back and forth and be embarrassed over a Zoom meeting. And it's actually ASP.NET that I screwed up. It's not it's not section scripts. What am I doing? The at section scripts. I lost my brain there for a second. So it's putting these scripts at the top of the page. If we run this again, you know how sometimes you write code and you're like, I know it's wrong, but I don't know why.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we're getting Shawn here. So effectively all that, the little bit of code we've written so far, you could certainly have just shoved Shawn in there. The power here is being able to change the data with code behind the scenes and have it appear on the page. And so let's go over here and let's, I'm going to surround this in a div real quick and just create another div. And I'm going to just add a button here. And I won't bother styling it. Click me. And here, instead of like naming this and wanting to set up a wired instance, I can actually just give it an attribute called vOn. And vOn is telling it that Vue itself wants to call a method on our Vue object when I click on this button. And so vOn is actually, for any event, it's vOn colon, in this case it's going to be click, that I want to call some method that will call in a second. And I'll just call this increment. This increment method will write over here in the Vue in just a second. But the idea here is really simple, is that all of the attributes that Vue uses start with a V dash. So you can really tell what is the responsibility of Vue and what isn't. And most of these have shortcuts, like colon click is actually the same as vOn click. You could use whichever you prefer. Was that a question?
No.
Okay. So over here in the index, we're going to create a new section here called methods. And so I can just say increment. In this case, I'm going to add a number here that I'll just say counter equals 0. An increment, probably not surprising to anyone, is just going to increment that counter. But in fact, I need to say this because what's attached here is the data into this method so that this points to the object that contains all the data. So let's put my name there. Let's put another set of curly braces and say counter, right? So if we refresh this now, that is very interesting that it started at 101. That's strange. Why is it saying 101?
I wonder if it means disconnect.
It's almost like it hates me today. 101. And it's not incrementing. Make sure there's not a, I might be running into a name collision, but that's still, I've never run into this before, so let's just find out what happened. Well, I am baffled. You guys are really, frankly, impressing me for how crazy.
No, this is a lot better because we actually get to see more of how things tie together. Usually people go through the presentation so fast that you kind of miss how things actually tie in. But when there's a problem,
Yeah.
you're like, that's how it works.
Yeah, that's really strange that it thinks the counter is 101. That is, and increment isn't actually touching it. Let's see what happens to in the console when I click it. Oh, you may have an infinite loop. That is, I love finding errors that I have never run into before. I might have an infinite loop. So let's find out where the infinite loop is. Let me comment out that. It thinks it's 0. Why is it pretending to click that button? That is weird. Oh. Again, I screwed up the syntax. Woohoo! The shortcut for click is actually the @, which because we're in Razor, I'd need to do with 2, but I'm just going to leave it as beyond. Colon actually is a binding syntax, and so what it was doing was creating it to bind a click attribute over and over and over again. But don't worry about it with that. Let's go back to where beyond. And so what I wanted to really show you before I got dragged down to the hole is that the power here is being able to change the data behind the scenes and be able to show you what it looks like and be able to surface that without you having to think about re-rendering or any of that. That you just have in the code here you're writing is just the code that you need, right? There's nothing special about this, that it knows about what the markup looks like. And that's really the power of most of these frameworks. But we can see that what we've been able to do here, if you've ever used Angular or React, is a lot simpler, and it's a lot simpler on purpose. The Vue team themselves used to work at Google, and they were consumers of the Angular stuff, and they were frustrated by the complexity. And that's why they've sort of taken this approach to be as simple as possible. So this is a really stupid example. Let's expand this and make it a little more interesting. Here on the server side, we're actually building this, each of those rooms. But we could be using an API and pulling those rooms so that they're more interactive. And so let's actually do that. I'm going to go to my cheat sheet again, because you do not want me writing this. We're going to add another piece of data that just contains 3 rooms. When we look at the JavaScript, this will make more sense. So as one of the properties here, I'm just going to create an array of objects that represent rooms, right? Just like the ones we have on the page now. And I'm doing this so that on our markup, instead of doing this on the server, we're going to go ahead and do it on the client. So I'm going to get rid of the for each. Actually, let me comment out the for each on the server side, just so you can see where we're making this change. And here in the div that represents one of those collections, we're going to add a V4. And a V4 is simply saying I want to loop between these. So for each R in room, I want to repeat this entire section, including the element I'm on. So you don't have to have a containing element or anything. And so here we can change, instead of the server-side syntax, we'll just use the client-side syntax. And I'm changing the case because that happens that I'm using the JavaScript camel case in here. If your objects used capitalization, you could use those as well. But it's just for stylistically, I prefer to use the mixed case in JavaScript and the Pascal case in .NET. Let me just fix those up, and I'll do the same thing here. And I'll try to do the same thing here, though this is, say that again?
You need the space in between the brackets like that?
You don't. It's more of a, I find it more readable.
No, it is. I was just curious, though. So I could see myself.
Yeah, not required at all.
Okay.
So I could go ahead and try to use this for source, but we'll get back to source in a minute because there's something else to see there. So let's go ahead and see this on the page. And if I've done it right, which clearly I haven't, or did I, and they showed it all? No. Oh, I made this change, but I no longer have that code inside of my app object, right? And I'm only telling Vue to be responsible for this. So let's go ahead and do a couple things. I'm going to first wrap these in their own div. Oops, there's the button. And I'm just going to move this outer object to be outside of our section here so that we really have everything in that same div. So now Vue is going to be responsible for everything, including that code. And once we do this, it'll say, hey, you've screwed something up. And the thing it's telling me I'm screwed up is compiling the template. And what compiling the template means is that I've screwed up the markup in some way. And usually they'll give you a clue, like this source. It doesn't like this syntax with the double braces. So let me remove the double braces. We'll get back to why that's important in just a moment. What do you mean? Oh, it's rooms, isn't it? Doo-doo-doo. And of course, I've completely screwed up the markup.
Yeah, I think it's your div class row.
Yeah, I'm just going to add another div around here. That looks better. So now we've got each of those rooms. The binding is wrong, but we can see that we're getting the right names based on our data and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and talk about the image, because there's a couple of things. First of all, the syntax here for how to get the image is going to be based on JavaScript. And so instead of first, I'm just going to go ahead and get the first in the index. But the other thing that's important is the curly braces don't work inside of attributes on purpose, right? What we want to do is actually tell it, hey, I want you to bind the source based on something in Vue. So we need a way of saying how to bind attributes, because this syntax is good for binding the bodies of an element. This is the syntax for binding to the attribute of an element. And in fact, like I screwed up before, that shortcut is the colon source. So once we have this, we should suddenly have images that don't work at all. Oh, Earl is lowercase as well. At least I'm consistent, right? And so for me, the power here isn't just that we've replaced what was on the server, but we want to make the experience a little better for the user. So what I want to do is here on the Book Now button is what do I want to do? I want to say on, click, for this button, I want to be able to say book room. And in fact, because we're inside of this for, I can actually pass in that room object. I don't have to pass in some ID and then look it up and do all this other work. It actually knows that when I click on the room, that it's just going to pass the same object that represents the item in that book they added. So back down here, get rid of that. I'm going to say book room. And I'm not going to actually book the room right now, but I'm going to say booking. Should never use alerts in any of your code, just so you know that. Room dot name, I think it's name, title. Just so we can see that we're actually, you know, passing that same object back. We are not looking it up. So the code that we're using for this room ends up being pretty simple. Make this a little smaller. Ooh, Omni room, Callan walls, right? So we're talking about a model of doing this data binding and be able to do the code we want pretty simply. So let's move back and let's actually change how we're getting these, because the reality is hard coding the rooms here is not a good idea, right? In fact, some would call it a terrible idea. That someone would probably be me. So how are we doing on time, by the way?
I think 7:07.
Have about another 15 minutes. Is that about right?
Oh, is it? It's not going till 8?
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of
It's
time.
after 8. Okay, good. So there's also some of ability here to do things on the load of the project. So I'm going to steal some code just to make it a little quicker for us. We'll ignore all that for a second. Where did you go? I know I added it here. Oh, I probably put it after sorting. Oh, God, what is the name of that? Well, it's very frustrating when I can't remember the name of one tiny element.
The getters?
Well, this is a good time to show you the docs. It's for some reason my brain's not working today. So Vue.js.org is where all the docs are. And I'll actually, let me stick to this for a minute so I can talk to you about when you're actually using Vue. Because the documentation is actually really good. I'm really always impressed by the documentation. They have a guide that sort of talks you through the basic elements of it, as well as a list of just all the APIs. But one of the things that I find very powerful here is this idea of an ecosystem. So they've built Vue as this small thing that does what we've shown, the sort of rendering of elements pretty simply. But they also have different parts of their ecosystem that they've written, like dev tools for the browser, a CLI for building applications, etc., and a router for doing multi-pages, and Vuex, which is sort of data handling. But at the bottom here, there's two lists. There's Vue Curated and Awesome Vue. I'm going to look at both of them real quick. Vue Curated is a list of packages that it knows works really well with Vue. And so they've curated this list of libraries that do things that Vue doesn't necessarily do well. And one of the ones we're going to use is actually Axios. It's right here. Axios is a promise-based networking library. Unlike some of the other libraries you may have used, Vue made the decision we're not going to do the things that we know that we're not necessarily good at. We're going to let the rest of the JavaScript framework world help us with that. And so instead of pretending that we're great at writing networking code, let's just make sure we work with, you know, if you want to use jQuery to do it, or you want to use Axios, you want to use some other thing, that you have the choice of which ones of these to work with. So we're going to actually work with Axios. And what we're going to do here is actually look at something called where is it? This is always embarrassing when I can't remember what it's called. Those are components, transactions, tooling. Come on. There it is, lifestyle hooks. So the idea, we're going to use Axios in a minute, but one of the things we want to do on our view object is have the idea of what are called lifestyle hooks. These are methods that are called within the life cycle of what view does. And the two that most people use are created, which is when the view object is created, or mounted, which is when it's actually shown on the screen. And so we're going to actually use mounted here. It's not inside the methods, it's a sibling of methods. To say, I want to do something when this is first mounted. And what do I want to do? I want to actually make a call out to the rooms. Let me make sure that my rooms controller is what I think it is, yeah. And in this case, I'm just going to do a get for the rooms. And when I get the response, let me just refactor this code just a little bit. I'm going to say this dot rooms equals response dot data. So I've gotten data from the server, and I'm just going to simply show it here, right? And I'm going to make this a little quicker with arrow functions that hopefully, it's always nice when I can simplify this code and use Lambda-like features that people will probably result. Or instead of this case, I'm actually going to show an alert because we're going to talk about these as well if we have time. A nice error message, right? You did something wrong. So when we first render this, there's two things we need to do. None of this markup code needs to change because I'm still dealing with the rooms. But of course, when we first show this page, the rooms is going to be empty, and so they're not going to render any of it until the room gets filled up by the network request. But we do need Axios to be installed here. So I'm going to go over to my package.json to add it as a new library. And I could use the tooling to do this as well. This is much quicker. And then I'm just going to include Axios.js before so that it actually runs. And if we execute this again, it failed. So it worked exactly the way I didn't expect it to. Run it again to see what it didn't like. Well, that's all helpful. Let's go to the network to see if I just had the wrong one. Yeah, rooms was retrieved. Let's debug it so we can see exactly what I screwed up, because we can all agree at this point I've screwed something up. I probably, oh, why does it say this?
I almost asked that earlier. That's in that code.
This, whoops. That looks better. The catch was fired because of the JavaScript error, not because of the other. And so we can now see that we're getting these from the server. None of our markup needed to change because, of course, I was mimicking the same object size as all of them, the shape of all of them. And of course, all the other code should continue to work as well. The fact that we got it from a server, who cares in some ways? And so that's sort of the story here. But of course, there's data that we often want to bind to that isn't just data from the server or data from the client, right? And so that's one other thing we'll do here is we'll actually add two more elements here to our data. One is going to be an error, which will start with an empty string. Excuse me. And we'll start an is busy flag so we can show when we're actually doing something interesting. And so how are we going to use these? Let's show them first in our markup. So at the top of the page, I'm just going to create a quick div, and I'm going to use Bootstrap in this case to create an alert. And I'm going to use another one of these view directives called vif, and I'm just going to say if error, so effectively it's saying if error is null or empty, then it's going to be false. If it has some data in it, then it's true. Just one of the things I like about JavaScript's dealing with strings that way is we're going to say if there's an error, show it here, show this warning on the top of the page. And so it allows us to get rid of the failed here and say this dot error equals failed. And what this does is it allows whoever is designing the page, whether that's you or somebody else, to decide how to display that. It takes the logic of what's actually happening in the design out of our hands and just say, we now have some data here. In the same way, I'm going to do something very similar for is busy. And is busy here is going to show, oh, why is there an S there? Only if the flag is true, and then I can say, please wait, loading, right? You could get fancier with that, but that should be enough for us to actually see that. And again, this would allow us to do things like this dot is busy equals true. So show the warning why we make the network request. And then in a finally block, this dot is busy equals false. So whether it gets an error or succeeds, we'll go ahead and turn that off, which of course on my local machine, you shouldn't be able to see. There's no error and there's none, but let's use a debugger to fake that. And you see the loading is shown while we're in this, and then if we continue to run it, it'll go away. And so there's a lot more to view than I'm showing you, but the heart of it is this ability to just create more interactive pages for users and to be able to start with this. Because one of the things that I want to be clear about is that as you go on, as you start to build larger and larger pieces, this number of scripts is going to get larger, and you may decide, hey, I want to bring in Webpack, or the application becomes large enough where like bringing in TypeScript with type safety makes sense. And you can do that. So you can start small and prototype and then sort of graduate as you need instead of having to opt into all that complexity at first. That's the big story for me of Vue, is this idea of being able to use it small or large, depending on how I'm actually doing it. Does that make sense to everybody?
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to assume you're nodding your heads.
Which way though is the question?
Yeah, it's my fault for even asking. So let's see if we have time. Yeah, I'll take a quick 10 minutes and talk about one last idea here that's important to a lot of people, and that is being able to build components. This feels a lot like, what we've done so far feels to me a lot like what I used to do with JavaScript, but maybe a little cleaner, a little nicer. I'm sorry, not JavaScript, jQuery, right? And in some corners, it's thought of that this is, you know, sort of like a jQuery replacement. You can drop it in, you can write some code, you can make things happen, and you can certainly use it that way. But most people end up building reusable components with Vue. And so let's do that with something very simple. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to create a new file called waitcursor.js. And this will just be an individual file. It doesn't have to be an individual file, but in my case, it'll be an individual file for a component that I want to be able to put on the page. And so I do this by calling view.component, and then giving it a name. In this case, I'll call it a weight cursor. It's not function. It's just an object. And here you're defining some idea, some markup for what you want a weight cursor to look like so that I could use it in a bunch of different cases. And so there's two pieces I need here. The first one is come on, where'd you go? First one I need is the template, which I'm going to steal just so we don't have to do it a couple of times. And the idea here really is, I like that backslash so I can put it on multiple lines so you can see kind of what we're doing. Or the backtick, is we're just saying what is the markup for this template. So let's go ahead and just put this in as is. We're not going to do anything with it yet. I just come over here, and instead of my weight cursor here, I'm just going to put weight cursor as an element, right? And so effectively what we're saying is, hey, I'm going to be able to create a element that has logic and code behind it. If we go ahead and look at this, oh, I need to add it to the page. In case you've not noticed, I do this every time I'm forgetting to put stuff on the page. There we go. Really? You're going to make me look like a fool.
You have an extra parentheses in your template.
Extra parentheses and weight cursor? Yeah, thank you.
There.
So there's our weight cursor. We don't have any text with it, and we're just displaying it on the page. And so we're defining that as just the markup, but we don't have any code really to do with it yet. And so what I'd like to be able to do is say something like if busy, right? I want to be able to display that if it's busy. And I might also like to put after this just the same sort of V binding here for whatever that message is, or let me put message just to make it a little more brief. And so, but how do we set these? We could set our own data element here with them, right? But components want to be able to be sent the data we want. And so we actually use something called props. Props are either an untyped or a typed version of properties that are being sent to it. And so I'm going to, not surprisingly, put busy as one of them and message as the other, right? I'm saying that these are the kind of properties can be set. And then what do we do over here? We simply say message equals please wait. And I'll get to the other one in a minute. Really? Oh, I know why. I know why. Because busy would be false by default. Let me get rid of that for a minute, just so we can see this part of it. So we can see the please wait is being put in there because this isn't even binding. This is actually just setting, not data binding, but just setting the attribute of this to be sent into the component. But if we bring back busy, we could say busy equals true in order to show it. But what we really want to do is bind to busy with is busy, right? We want to take what is in our parent component and send that piece of data down into the component. And this is the world's simplest sort of component. So I don't think that you would need to do this for every little thing that you want, but just to prove to you it actually shows up as please wait. We can see that what we're really getting here is a reusable piece of code. And this could be a weight cursor. This could be the customer panel. This could be, even something much larger. Often these apps will be built as a number of components with just the markup that's in here being really brutally simple, right? You could imagine taking this and making it a component that you might need on 2 or 3 pages. And you can start here and sort of move to things that are more complex later on. Does that make sense? I should be looking at your faces. Cool. Let me go back to the slides for just a minute, just to show you that, there we go. So you can get this demo out on wilderness.com tomorrow when I do a quick post about this user group, and it'll have links over to the slides and the code. And then, of course, you can get view at viewjs.org. Any questions about anything I've talked about?
No. I have
It's always
when you're creating a template, so in the template piece, you have to hard code in the HTML. Is there a way to like just do kind of like a partial, you know, like with NBC where like you have a partial page and then you're getting it from there? Or is that even a horrible idea, or?
It's not a bad idea at all. What's interesting is there's a few different ways to approach that. You can certainly separate these, as I do often when I'm building these small things, into their own files and then having them pulled from the server. If I've opted into the Webpack scenario where I have something more complex, they actually have something else called a single file component. And let me pull up an example of that real quick.
Yeah, because the one thing when I see that right away is like, I know I would mess up like the HTML typing in there.
You would. And so that's one of the reasons a lot of people like this approach of single file components. And so this is another example I have. And what you'll see is these .view files, VEU files. Let me go to one that's more complex than that. So here I have a template, a single file that has a section called template. And this is just for the markup itself. Has a section called script, and then it optionally also has a section called style so that you can have view-specific CSS. And so in this way, you can actually build with the kind of editor help for all the markup that you know, so you don't screw it up. And when it compiles this, it compiles it into the 3 different pieces for you and validates it and does whatever. And script can even be written in different languages. So the standard template uses HTML. The standard script uses JavaScript, but you could use some of the meta languages out there for markup that you may prefer. This is more common in the Node world than the C# world for templates. You could use TypeScript instead of JavaScript here, or other scripting languages that compile down to JavaScript. You could even use CoffeeScript, but I can't suggest that for anybody. So there is a way that I discuss in my course. I have like a 7-hour view course on wilderminds.com that explains some ways to do it both in the non-build scenario and in the build scenario. It makes it a tiny bit more complex, but not by much. The Vue team on purpose decided not to be doing network requests by default for every piece of markup, and so having template files on the server that it downloads, which is the way that some other libraries work, just didn't make sense for the Vue team. So they didn't build anything in there to do that by default, because they thought, why are we adding more network requests when we don't need them? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Anything else? Well, thank you guys for having me. If you have questions, you can always post it on the blog that I put about the user group in case something comes to you later or you don't want to ask in front of everybody else.
Well, thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn.
You're welcome. And enjoy your pizza.
Oh, yeah.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
I guess I'll visit the meeting.